of the way, there we go. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce um, someone who has been so instrumental to my stay at Penn State and to so many people who have been at Penn State, Professor Jennifer Hamer, who is a professor of African American Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Pennsylvania State University. She is a nationally respected scholar of African American families, the working class communities, and she has done a lot of research and writing on inequities in higher education. In addition to her academic work, Professor Hamer has held senior leadership and administrative roles at major research universities, including the University of Illinois, the University of Kansas, Penn State, and where she has served as a vice provost for diversity and equity. She has also been an associate vice provost for faculty affairs. As you can clearly see, there's a reason why I'm so excited to have this person come in to speak to us. I mean, she has led such large-scale multi-campus initiatives focusing on advancing, equity, inclusion, belonging. She has worked on strengthening faculty leadership and mentoring. She has led in research and writing that has targeted and addressed structural inequities in higher education. Along with all of those big issues that she has worked on, she has created absolutely amazing academic environments where students, faculty, staff can thrive. I want to say on a more personal note, she has been a coach and a mentor to me, and I am so very excited to welcome you, Professor Hamer, to this session. Welcome.
That was much too generous, but thank you. It's good to be here.
Right, good. The format of this session is more a conversation between me and Professor Hamer, and then after that we will hand over to Wanjiru if there are people who want to engage with Professor Hamer directly. There are a couple of questions that I prepared, which I would like to read through. The first one is a very mundane one, and it runs like this, that if you were to tell your own life story as an academic, where would you begin? Right.
Yeah, you gave me that question ahead of time. Yes. I had a really hard time. I gave it some thought, but it wasn't that easy. It probably wouldn't be easy for a lot of us here. So I'm a first generation student. So first of all, I don't even know when I learned what academic meant, right? And Wanjiru, you may have heard this story before, right, in terms of how I got started. But I was first gen, and as a child, I always asked a lot of questions. I was always very curious, especially with regard to fairness. I remember my dad was from North Carolina, which is in the South, Southern United States. And I remember visiting, and we were just walking across someone's lawn. Now, my dad's family used to be a sharecropping family, so there was a lot of racial tension in the area when he was growing up. But we were walking across someone else's lawn, and my dad was with us, and he just started yelling at us and screaming at us to get off this person's lawn. And for him, it was a matter of safety, right? So I know I saw a lot of white kids walking across the lawn, but for some reason, his Black children weren't allowed to do that because he feared for our safety. And so it led me to ask questions about his history, right? What was it like to grow up there, et cetera? But I was always curious about anything that seemed unfair. The fact that I had to do dishes and my brother did not, right? So the chores I had at home were every day. My brother's chores were once a week, and there just wasn't anything fair about that. So going into academics, I think I was definitely led by curiosity, but moving in that direction was completely accidental. My parents had no idea what it meant to go to college. It wasn't a conversation in our household. And I only ended up going because I had some friends who got scholarship money to go. So I didn't know that you could actually get money to go to school. That's how I ended up there. But in terms of moving towards like becoming a professor as a profession, In my senior year as an undergrad, I had my first Black professor who decided that I needed to do more than just go into the workforce. He decided that I had a lot more to offer. So he saw something in me that I didn't see. And he helped me understand what it meant to be a professor. Even the title professor, I had no idea what that meant. I didn't know how you got to be a professor. I just knew we called him professor, right? But I didn't know that there was this like journey, right, to achieving that title. Again, I think it was just my curiosity about unfairness, about inequity. I started as an undergrad interested in being a teacher. Then I went to psychology. Then I went to sociology, which is my field. And it's in my introductory sociology course that I really began to understand how the world worked, right? Helped me to really understand why we do have this persistent inequity and what it looks like, the different forms that it takes, et cetera. So I don't really know how to answer that question. You want to?
Yes, that's very useful. But what did your parents understand by being an academic? What did they think you actually do?
They didn't really think I worked. They didn't really think that I did anything, right? They knew that I did a lot of reading and that I did a lot of writing, that I always had papers to do. Just, if you could just you think back to when you were an undergrad, right? And I always worked. I worked all the way through my undergrad education and lived on my own. I did not live at home, and I didn't have the experience of living in the residential dorms like a lot of students here do. So they didn't understand it when I went home, like for breaks, and I would bring my books, I would try to study, and my mom would just have the television on, right, really loud. And then she would always want to be in conversation with me. Well, of course I want to be in conversation, but I also have to study. Oh, she just didn't get it, you know. And I don't think she understood it until she didn't begin to see it as work until my brother got his PhD, until my brother started teaching, until my brother started writing, right? Then that's work, right? But for me, even today, she's always more concerned about my brother, how tired he is, how much he has to work, right? And me, you know.
Right.
Yeah. So, but my journey was really just a traditional one. You know, when I graduated before my cohort, I went to University of Texas, San Antonio, small college. Then I went to Texas A&M in College Station for my master's, and then University of Texas for my PhD. And the latter two institutions, I was the only Black person in these programs at the time. When I was coming in, one was going out. When I was going out, one was coming in. And that's just simply the way that it was. But when I graduated, I didn't really have strong mentorship who helped me in the job market. So I took my mom's advice and accepted an appointment in her hometown. That was the start of my career. And that was that. I mean, you're gonna, I think, ask me questions later, and I can kind of get to those experiences. But very much an accidental academic, because it was just a job to me. It was just a job to me.
It was just a job. Okay. But then, this question is in two parts. When you think about where you are now, and you think about how your other colleagues, cohorts, etc., who took a completely different path, right? What do they think Jennifer Hammer does? You must have some friends I have my own friends, ones that are still alive. And I'm always curious to think, what do they think I actually do? What do they think Jennifer Hammer does?
So you're really talking about my family. Some of very
No, you don't have to talk about. We can talk about it. Just it's a question of trying to understand how the other people that are connected to you see?
I think that those close to me, it depends on if they're academics or not, right?
Okay.
But I think in general, people see me as making trouble. That's really how people see me, right? If something needs to be done, ask Jenny to do it. If something happened, what did Jenny do? You know, so I think that's really how even as a child, that's how I was seen, as someone who just made trouble. I guess, you know, nowadays it's called good trouble, right? But and I think in many respects that explains my career trajectory, right? Because I'm more of a scholar activist, and I was more of a scholar activist earlier in my career. But it was really me raising my curiosity. Why does it have to be that way? And not accepting inequities, right? So that's really what moved me through, and I think that's how people generally see me, right? As someone who takes things on and gets things done, or who's unafraid. I don't know that that's always true in terms of who I am, but that's generally how they see me, right? As someone to go to. Wenjiro may be able to speak to that, right? Because she's actually part of my network here, you know, so. But I think that's generally how people see me, as someone who's accomplished, not always sure what I'm doing at any time, but expect that it's probably doing something toward the greater good.
And then we have on this platform a lot of young scholars, emerging scholars, people who are still trying to determine the direction of their careers, etc. What advice, one, would you give them? Two, what advice would you say is bad advice to give to junior scholars from senior people?
Okay, I'll start with the second question. What is bad advice?
Yeah.
Well, I would say, well, let me just put it this way. I would say always remember how you got there and your purpose, right? Always remember that. Always keep that centered. So what is your purpose? What are your values? And let that center you in your decision making. Bad advice, I don't know. I mean, there's advice, you know, people can give it. I won't say bad advice. I don't know if I would use that, but I think that sometimes folks of color, women faculty, and folks of color in particular, when they come into institutions, there are some senior scholars who will warn them of an institution, right? Oh, you know, that place is racist. You're probably not going to get tenure there. You know, they're going to make it difficult for you. And I would say, ignore that, right? And I'm not saying that race, gender, sexuality, I'm not saying those things don't matter. I'm not saying that, but I want you to keep in mind that you're already accomplished, right? When you walk in the door. And that was with all of those identities. So don't let anyone take away your accomplishment and reduce it to race, gender, you know, and other identities. Just don't do that. The other thing that I would warn newer scholars about is don't listen to gossip about colleagues, right? In other words, when you walk in the door, kind of accept people as they are, right? And how and appreciate your experience with them. Don't allow others or hearsay. Don't allow others' experiences influence your own. Let me just say that. Because you always have to be your own person. You really do have to think critically, not just about what we read, but in the worlds that we live in. You have to think critically about the information that you're receiving, right, from senior scholars who are, I'm sure, respected in the field, probably really good people, but you have to be your own thinker. You really do have to be your own thinker. You decide on your research agenda, right? You decide who you're going to engage with. You decide who you're going to trust and who you're not going to trust. Don't rely on others to do that. So some good advice, or some advice that you can decide whether it's good. I would say when you come in, again, as I said, really center on who you are and appreciate that you are already accomplished. No university is going to hire you if they don't think you're going to get tenure. So just push aside all that negative stuff that you may hear about a university, about a department, about a person. Put it aside. Universities are in the business of tenuring faculty. They hire faculty that they want to see successful, right? And some universities, not all, have the resources to support that, right? So, because when you're hired, you're an investment, right? That organization, that institution has invested in you. So believe in yourself. Believe in yourself. The other thing that I would advise is don't isolate. It's easy to do when you're like the only one, but don't isolate. Don't discard your previous networks, right? Hold on to all your networks, grow your networks, internally and external to the institution that you're at, because you will want someone that you can trust as a mentor. You'll want at least someone, and you have mentors for different things, right? Someone who can support you in your scholarship or advise you on your scholarship, someone who can advise you on the service that you may be doing, your public engagement, right? There, you can have a bevy of mentors, right? But at the end of the day, you make the decisions about you, not your mentor. The other types of, so there's mentors, there are sponsors, and a sponsor is someone who's going to connect you to people, right? Someone you want to get to know because they can connect you to people, to conference panels, to publication possibilities, right? That's a sponsor. And then there are coaches. You know, Manjuri mentioned that I'm a coach. That's someone who you can have a conversation with as you're trying to think through a problem or trying to reach a particular goal. So there are all kinds of people who can be a part of your network and your orbit. Just kind of pay attention to that and don't isolate yourself from people. Yeah, I'm sure there's much more, but you know, it's a big question. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's very useful. But I want to uh, shift the focus a little bit. What we were talking about is the good or in quotes bad advice to junior colleagues. What if I walked into your office and I said, I'm a bit confused about the direction of my own career? What advice would you give me? How of I would say that I'm unsure about where I'm going with my career, right? Because I guess even senior scholars need some advice. What advice do you give people like me?
Okay, so it probably wouldn't matter what stage you're at in your career. I would ask you, what is it that you want? What is it that you want? And you may not know. And so we might talk about what you feel your purpose is, right?
Okay.
We might think about what is it that you value, what's most important to you, so that you can think about where you want to go with your career, but do it in a more concrete way.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Right. Now, the other question, I gave you some of these questions before, but this one will be an interesting one. Your areas of research and why did you choose them? And how have your areas, what are your areas of research? And why did you choose them? Two, how have those areas of research changed you?
Okay. So my research agenda begins in graduate school, right, with your dissertation. And I was actually really interested in studying race and racial stratification. But I was at the University of Texas, and the only race scholar there, I won't say his name, but he was well known in the field. I mean, he was like the person to study with, but he was a white scholar. And when I walked into his class, I was the only Black person in the class. And I had all of these white students around me who knew way more about race than I did. And it was so extremely uncomfortable that eventually I left the class. But it wasn't because it was uncomfortable, it was because he called on me in class to answer a question about the Black experience. And I ended up leaving that class. Then I was also interested in gender. So I signed up for a class in gender with the leading scholar in gender studies. And I won't say this person's name. They did the same thing, right? And so I ended up leaving that class. And I ended up getting to know a faculty member who studied families. And that was really my trajectory in graduate school, being the only one and trying to figure out how I fit in, right? I had my interests, but I felt my interests, I didn't feel comfortable following my interests because of the people who were teaching on the subject and really didn't know how to teach, how to work with students of color, people like me, right? So that kind of kept me moving and continuing to explore these questions. So I ended up studying families. And then the area that I settled on was African American non-custodial fathers who have never lived with their children. And the reason was because there was a lot of conversation, right? And a lot of research coming out around this time about African American fathers and how they're absent, how they're not present. Basically, all they do is impregnate women and then move along, right? They're in prison. There was nothing positive coming out about the Black father experience. But I came from a Black community, a Black family. And so with my own eyes, I could see that there were problems with the narrative. And so that's how I ended up studying fathers. I ended up publishing what I did not know at the time was the very first book about non-custodial Black fathers from the perspective of those fathers. So I didn't know that it was groundbreaking work at the time, because to me, it was just a question that I couldn't find the answer to. And I was very fortunate to tap in to the mentorship of leading Black family scholars at the time who weren't at my institution, but I was brave enough to reach out to them, and they were generous enough to engage. They were just generous. So that changed me. I can't say it changed me, but it gave me, it helped me to, I think, be who I am today, someone who thinks it's really important to give back, right? To support others. So, I mean, in terms of my scholarship, I finished that book and then wrote one that was about Black families more broadly in working class communities. And that's still an interest of mine. But then I became an administrator. And that's when research kind of just halted. I still did research, but I did institutional research, right? So I was still writing, but for institutions, right? And that definitely changed my outlook on higher education, because I was able to see it, from behind the scenes. And it's not always pretty. It can produce a lot of beauty, right? But behind the scenes, it's a lot of hard work. You really begin to see all the problems. There's something else that influenced my research, and that was my experience as in the Black Radical Congress, which was about 2000, 2001, 2002. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, but it was scholars from across the US and abroad who met in Chicago to kind of renew kind of a Black power movement, right? But there were more scholars in that than there were kind of everyday people, people outside of the academy. But I learned a lot about how Black studies scholars think about their work. And I consider myself a Black studies sociologist. And by that, I mean, the work that I do isn't just academic. It's about improving the lives of communities and of people. So we can talk about, what that means, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I have two last questions. The first one is, I think, more relevant to what is currently happening at the moment in our college, you and me, as we try and reunify African studies and African American studies. You don't have to answer it, but what do you think are the advantages and what do you think are the challenges as we go through this particular process of the merger of African studies and African American studies?
Yeah. So yeah,
yeah,
I'll barely answer that because it could be politically fraught. But
that's what I'm
so
saying. That you don't have to
so
answer.
essentially, what's happening for those who don't know, so we're at Penn State University, and in 2012, the dean at the time split the department of what was it, African and African American Studies
Yeah.
into two separate entities. One, the Department of African American Studies, and then the program or the African Studies program, right? So left it without departmental status. And when you don't have departmental status means you have the ability to hire and tenure faculty, right? So you really lose a lot when you become a program and not a department, right? In terms of funding and stature, status internally as well as externally. And then that ability to tenure folks is really important. It's critical, right? So that happened in 2012, and now the current dean has decided to reunify those units, right? To elevate African studies back into a department status, right? So it'll be, we don't know what the name of it will be, African and African American Studies, Africana Studies, we don't know, that's a conversation. So what do I like about it? Well, I don't even know why it was split, right? But certainly the trend, it aligns us with our peers in terms of how we approach the Black experience globally, because certainly there are differences, right, among Black people, but there are also a lot of similarities that I think can sometimes get lost in the scholarship, but most importantly, lost to students, right, who many, we have like students coming from the continent, right, to the United States, to Penn State to study, and oftentimes come with a lot of assumptions about African Americans. Sometimes not positive ones. And on the other side, we have African American students who have a lot of negative assumptions about students coming from Africa, right? And we see it play out in how they engage outside the classroom. So this is an opportunity, I think, to help them to have a better understanding of our shared history and the realities of the Black experience more, globally. So there's that. There's also opportunities for research, right? Collaborative research. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. There's bringing these together, I think, it's also a challenge. And oftentimes that's around hiring decisions. Are we going to hire an Africanist or an African Americanist, right? Are we going to have an Africanist as a department head or an African Americanist? It's always these either or. My hope is that we can dispense of those boundaries, right? And agree on our shared goals and work toward them. That's my hope and expectation. I think there's always going to be a bit of a challenge. Even if it was just a Department of English, you have those challenges. Are we going to hire someone, 18th century or 20th century literature, or, so I think nothing that can't be overcome.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. The last question is the most important one. What are your hobbies?
My hobbies?
Yes.
I knit. I'm a knitter, and I just started weaving.
Oh, okay.
So in addition to that, I'm a fitness. I probably exercise about 90 minutes a day. I have a gym in the lower level of my home. And so when I'm not in a meeting or taking a break, that's where I'm at, or walking my dog.
Okay.
Those are my hobbies. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Jenny, for this. let me hand over to Wanjiru. Let's say thank you to Jennifer for this interesting conversation. But I'm sure a lot of you have got questions, and so let's say thank you first. Right. Okay. Wanjiru.
Yes. Oh my God. Yes, this was a wonderful conversation, but I wasn't expecting any less than that. I'm really excited about all the things I've learned about you, Professor Hamer. I must admit, some of them I didn't know. And so this is really nice to get the history. But I also wanted to reflect that I think meeting is great. I need to take it up. That was the most
I'll
important
teach you.
Thank you. I really agree. I have a couple of questions just following up from some of the things that you discussed and more points of elaboration rather than questions. And of course, having the privilege of having had you as a coach for time during my career, I'm really keen to share some of the things that you shared with me through these elaborations. So the first one, I think I just wanted to reflect once again. Thank you so much for your conversation. Is you mentioned about when an early career academic or a person who's coming into the industry needs to be a little bit more confident, step in. The university actually wanted you, that's why they got you in, and ability to get tenure and so on and so forth. I think for me, and I'm sure this question might be reflected by other early career academics, how do I get the confidence to walk into a room knowing that I am bringing something to the table and not coming from a negotiation point where I'm like, oh my goodness, I am feeling reserved or I'm feeling scared. I'm still trying to find my place. How do I walk to the table feeling that I have the confidence to negotiate in that space?
Are you talking about like at the point of hire?
Well, I think at the point of going through, it could be at higher, but also going through the tenure process.
Ah, well, I think if you're going through the tenuring process, either you've done the work or you haven't. That's essentially it. So in the United States, and I wish I could speak more broadly, but my experiences in the United States at multiple institutions, um, everyone comes in with a contract. These are the expectations. You're expected, depending on your field, you're expected to produce a book. You're expected to produce 10 to 12 articles or a book and a handful of articles. You know what it is. You know from the outset. And so what I find when people get kind of in trouble is that they may have listened to some advice about spending more time going to conferences, doing public speaking, right? Things that actually, or serving on committees, doing service work, right? Instead of focusing in on the job expectations. That is, you have to have this book. You have to have these articles. There's no way around it. And it doesn't really matter how many public talks you've had. Those will not count toward your tenure, right? It doesn't matter how many conferences you've been featured in. It will not, it doesn't, it counts, but it doesn't replace the book. It doesn't replace the published material. So, so that's where I see people getting in trouble headed toward tenure is that it feels really good when people invite you to be on a panel. It feels really good when someone asks you to appear on the radio or Sirius XM, or CNN. But those things will not get you tenure. In the meantime, everyone is seeing you as a very public figure, and they think that you're doing everything you're supposed to do, right? But those things aren't going to get you tenure. And if you walk in doing what you have done, then you don't have to worry about tenure. You don't have to worry about it. You'll get it because you've done what you're supposed to do. They can't take that away from you. So you can still be anxious, but be confident in what you've accomplished, right? And look to your contract to tell you what you need to do, in addition to conversations with your department head.
I love that answer because I think that's very strategic. It lets you go back to the big. And I remember having this exact same conversation with you when you tell me, Angelo, it's great that you've been invited to a conference. So how many papers have been published? And I remember you just putting me back on track, which I absolutely loved because that really did give me a strategic focus. So thank you for that response. My second question regards the topic of mentorship. How do you identify the right mentor for you? Because I think one of the biggest pitfalls is, you get into a university, whatever system it is, and for me, having worked in both African and here in the US, there are all these people who are doing great research, they're doing all these amazing things, but they're not the right mentor for you, right? And how do you identify the right mentor who's going to take your career where you need your career to go, your academic career, rather than somebody who's just going to be your friend, your buddy, pal, pal? Yeah.
You need that too. You need someone who's going to be a friend, someone who's going to be like the board that you can bounce ideas and terrible experiences off of, right? Well, I think there's an assumption that you absolutely have to have a mentor to be successful, right? In some sort of formal, traditional way. I just don't know that that's the case. I think you need mentors, right? You need people who can be there for you at different periods of time and for different things. How do you know who's a good mentor for you? Let me also add, if you're getting tenure, it's you getting it, not your mentor. You're the one who's doing that work, right? They may be advising you, giving you some suggestions, but you're making the decisions about you, not them. Okay, so I just want to give you credit, right? So I think a good mentor is someone who genuinely cares about your success. Genuinely cares, is willing to take the time to listen to you, to tell you when, I disagree. I don't think that's a great idea. I don't think that's good advice. Someone who's going to be very honest with you, right? But really someone who cares, right? And who has the time. I think you'll know when someone is a good mentor. You don't need a mentor who's just going to affirm everything you say. And I think a mentor is only as good as you allow a mentor to be. You can't look for a mentor to make your decisions.
Mm-hmm.
You have to do that. And sometimes that's really hard. But that doesn't mean the person doesn't care, or is not supportive. So it's a hard question to answer. I'm really struggling with that one. Because I think everyone has the potential to be a good mentor. But that's a two-way street. It's a mentee-mentor relationship, not just what does a mentor do, but what is a mentee doing as well?
I think that's a great answer because if I was to repeat what I heard you say, I think what I'm hearing is that you want somebody who's supportive, you want somebody who's also critical in a positive way for you. So they're able to offer a lens of maybe comparison or even advice that you might not want to hear. So somebody who's actually critical and critically analyzing what you're doing, but also it's a two-way street, right? I can't come to you expecting to get only from you if I'm not giving. So I think those are the three things I'm taking away from that. So actually, I think that was a really good response and I'm grateful for it. And I think the last one is a little bit more nuanced before I open it up. And it's a little bit around what is currently happening in the academic space, especially with regards to your area of expertise as a sociologist, but also in African and African studies. So I'm really very curious, I think is the word I'm going to use. Curious. You talked about your experiences at University of Texas, walking into a space where you are required to be the representative of a whole community of people, or walking into a space where you're required to be the representative to a whole gender. And right now, we are having a lot of pushback in the academic space around, academic freedom, around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think my question to you is, when you're in a university space, how do you navigate a place where, number one, you're considered to be the representation or the representative of a particular group or race of people, but at the same time, you don't want to carry the burden of do your work. Like, I don't have to be the person to tell you what to do. So I think my question, maybe more succinctly, is how do you navigate a space where the external environment is telling you that you have no right to be there, but the internal environment wants you to be a representative of everybody?
Well, that's an interesting one. Well, first of all, I would say if you're in a space, you have the right to be there. So don't let anyone question that. And again, I think it's just being confident in what you bring into a room, because that can definitely very easily be shaken, and I wasn't always confident. I'm actually an introvert, right? I definitely prefer to be on my own, but I had to learn to put myself out there if I wanted to accomplish what I felt needed to be accomplished. So that just So you kind of just to put yourself in places where you have to assert yourself. In terms of being representative, you can just say that I don't represent everyone, right? Just because other people think it, and they think it because they have you in the room or they have you in a committee. You can actually speak to that, right? I don't think this is a very representative committee. I'm the only one here, and I can't speak for everyone. So you have the power to speak, right? To define a situation, right? Instead of letting assumptions kind of carry the room. You can speak on that. And I think the more you speak up, the more confident you will be, right? And at the same time, you'll be seen as trouble. You may not be asked to be on the next committee, right? People will stop inviting you over for a coffee, or they will, but they won't let anyone know, right? So you can easily become marginalized when you speak. So that's, to me, the greater challenge, right? How much do you want to? How brave are you? That's one. And then how do you pick your battles, right? So that you can be in the spaces that you feel like you really need to be in, and you're not marginalized from them. That has been the greatest challenge for me. And at a certain point, I decided that, listen, this is what I was hired to do. I'm going to do it. And it was certainly problematic for a lot of people. So I don't know if that's a great answer, Winter. I don't even know if
Okay. As a human rights lawyer, I think that's the right answer. For me, I'm always like, how brave do I want to be? What war do I want to pick? Am I going to roll up my sleeves and go, to battle, or am I going to be the diplomat and sit in a pacifist environment and say, well, we could look at it both ways. So I think that's a great answer. It's a complicated situation, especially in the environment that we currently are in. So thank you, Professor Hamer. Those were my questions. I will open it up, but first I'd like to kind of just move to the chat feature and uplift some of the comments that were there. So I think Professor Makoni Busi put a comment in the chat, if I could read it out. She says, you mentioned that there are similarities among Black people. This struck a chord with me because you were talking about your early life within the family. I could swear you were talking about my experience, and yet I grew up in Africa. I did everything, and schoolwork was not that much of a priority, especially for girls, because the assumption was that we were going to get married at some point. The getting married part being one of the cultural differences with your experience growing up in the US. The glamorization or respect for what boys do and the denigration of what girls seem to be is similarity. I think that's her reflection, and I also concur with that. So I just wanted to lift that up, and I think Cecile asks, Busi, do you think there's also a class dimension too? So I think that's fine. And maybe Cecile will ask that one a little bit, maybe, and expand on that. I see you. And just before I open up the floor, I think there is, Anissa says, when planning, take advice, when acting, take responsibility. Wonderful. Thank you for that. Going back to your question, Cecile, do you want to just elaborate a little bit? No. She says no.
Well, if it's in general, I think class is always a dynamic, as a new faculty member, whether regardless of the organization or the institution, class is also part of our identities, right? I was first generation, and I don't have a fantastic vocabulary. I didn't go to private schools. I went to public schools, and so my vocabulary has expanded since I went to college, but it's still a very working class, middle class vocabulary. And if you look at how I write, I'm writing for a broad audience. I'm not writing for academics. Part of that is because I want to reach people beyond the academy, but the other part of that is because that's just not how I think and write, and I think that there's very much a class dimension to that, and I'm not comfortable trying to to write like an academic, if that makes sense. It kind of puts me in a world that I'm not comfortable with. I'm just comfortable being me. And I have to say, uh, being Black, being a woman, and being a first gen, I have often felt like a second class citizen, um, based on all these three identities independently and together, in at conferences, for example, in classrooms. I remember when I went to the University of Texas, my very first class was in the tower, which is like, I don't know, 27 stories high. And so I go, first of all, I'm intimidated by the space. There aren't any other Black students in the class. And I get up there, it's the very first class day. The professor hasn't shown up, and the students in the class are talking about bicycling and taking a trip for spring break to bicycle. Okay. Then they started talking about their bikes. Well, their bikes were like, they were talking about the cost of bikes. These are $10,000 bikes, $15,000 bikes. I was completely, I was so intimidated. It was like being in a completely different world. And so I had to focus on my purpose there, right? I was there to get this PhD, whatever that meant, right? And I was there to learn. So I had to stay focused on that. And that's where I found that I was actually as good as, if not better, than the folks who came in with the more elite education and access to the world. So class matters, bottom line. Sorry to be long-winded.
No, that was great. Professor Makoni, did you want to say something?
Yes. Where is Arthur? Arthur, do you want to jump in?
Yeah.
Yes.
I have, thank you for sharing your, I think, more personal experiences in the academy. I'm African American. My family, descendants of U.S. slaves. I grew up under segregation. And so when I went off to college, it was like going to study abroad. I left the Black world to go to the white world, and literally in many ways, at least going from the US to study in a foreign country where they spoke English, but it wasn't the same kind of English and they didn't use it the same way. So as you talk, and you mentioned many things that are fascinating for me, I was, of course, comparing your experience to my experience, but something else came to mind while you were talking is I was thinking about the experiences of so many African American scholars in undergraduate school and as graduate students. And it's amazing that it's so difficult, at least for me, in that rumination of all of these experiences. It struck me that it's so hard to find a common experience. There's so many individual Black American experiences based on, of course, things like class, and gender and all of these other factors. But there's also a factor that I always think about and that I write about, and that so few academics write about, which is skin color discrimination and or colorism, as is it often called. And all of those things come together in the experience of the individual African American student. And I often wonder, number one, if there's some literature on this. It should have occurred to me and asked before, but you've got so many things to do. You can't follow everything that's interesting. What I want to say, I think my main question that I'd like to ask you, did you ever find yourself in the process? Oh, let me back up. How did you approach the educational institutional settings that you found yourself in. And of course, there were several of them, undergraduate school and the various graduate programs. Did you find yourself studying your environment, your institutional environment, systematically and doing that as a result of having discovered certain principles along the way? And I'll give you an example. When I was an undergraduate, I found out very early that there was a huge difference between American professors and foreign professors. Now, back then, where I was, virtually all of the professors were white. So we're talking about white American versus, and all the non-American professors were also virtually all white. So it was the difference between white Americans and European Americans. They were also European. And there was an absolutely incredible difference between the two. And I must have found this out during my first year as an undergraduate. So from that, I drew a principle. White European professors are much easier to work with. They're interested in me as an individual, not as a statistic. They don't assume that I'm not qualified to be there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They were willing, and this is very important. I soon learned that when grading was not completely objective, that I could get A's from European professors, but not from American professors, with very few exceptions. And then later on, it became even more refined. American white professors from the coast were much easier to work with than those from the center of the country. By the coast, I mean Berkeley, UCLA, and then on the other coast, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and so on and so forth. So there was a class element to that. Did you find, and I'm going to wrap up my question, yourself studying your academic environments, and I put that in plural, analytically? Or do you think you mostly just went along the way and dealt with situations and issues as they came up before you? So did I make that clear enough?
I think so. Certainly as an undergrad, I was just learning. I was a full-time employee and I was a full-time student. So, I didn't even know much about research as an undergrad. So certainly I think I just kind of went along the way. Though I was quite aware of race at that time, right? Race and gender. Class, not so much in terms of how it might be impacting my experience. I was a straight A student though. That's because I was super competitive. So I was confident enough to assert myself in the classroom and ask questions when I got a 99 instead of 100, right? So that's just who I was as an undergrad student. And I've always been a very competitive person. So, but now once I become a faculty, well, actually as a master's student, I began to study higher education and its outcomes. So that really opened the door for me to understand that even once you have a degree, right, and the same degree, you're still going to have differences, right, by gender or by race, right, in terms of pay and outcome. So once I become an assistant professor, then the answer is yes. I do begin to explore how institutions work, right? As a response to my own experiences and my observations and my engagement with people who were like me, right? So at that point, once I'm an assistant professor, I begin to realize that, people are treated differently, right, based on these identities. And I begin to write grants, access grants to to basically institution building, to build programs, right, to support certain populations. And certainly by the time I'm an associate professor at the University of Illinois, that's just what I do, right? I'm challenging the provost, challenging the chancellor, challenging the dean, but not in ways that are about tearing down. It's about improving the environment. And I don't know that I've ever done anything that was for me, right? It's rather for Black faculty and staff, or for Black faculty, Black students, right? I've never stepped up and demanded anything from me, except for in one case at Illinois. But yeah, I mean, that's how I ended up going into full-time administration. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but absolutely, that has really been my purpose in higher ed.
Yeah, it sort of does, but yeah, it's a vast area to explore.
I mean, if you want to give me a different question to help me clarify, I'm happy to do that, to try.
You see how I put it. I think I'll leave it there for the moment, but
Okay.
maybe later on I'll have a better version of it. But thanks a lot for your response.
Okay, I think Sally's hand is up.
I'm in a guest house in Dakar, Senegal at the moment. So I hope you can hear me well. Do you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll echo Arthur Spear's comments regarding diversity in the Black population. I'm Congolese and Francophone, and when I came to the United States, that was the first time I was taking all my classes in English. And I stood out in the crowd. I was the only Black until I noticed there were two other Black students in the class. But they were not in my department of linguistics. That made a whole lot of difference. So in many classes, I was just the only Black, and I had a stronger accent than today. And every time I opened my mouth, everybody would turn around and look at me. I didn't quite know how to interpret that particular kind of situation where people said, is it because they were interested in my ideas, or were more interested in the questions or the questions I asked or the comments that I made? But, as time went by, I realized that it is difficult to generalize from my experience to that of other people. I mean, the way I followed your discussion is like everything being equal. But for me, it's not everything being equal. And each individual case is different in some ways, though there are a lot of similarities. So, I mean, that's the principle of family resemblance. You are all alike, but you are also so different in a number of ways. And so here is an example. I publish a paper, and another colleague who is also Black publishes a paper, and we get different reactions to our views that are very similar. And I concluded the difference lied in the way that we package our information. The same idea, one paper was too aggressive, and the other one not so aggressive, rather moderate. But the message is the same. It's like a pill that doesn't have a good taste, and you sugarcoat it. One of you sugarcoats the pill, and the other one doesn't sugarcoat it, and you get different reactions. And one faces hostility, and the other one, people want to talk to them because they find the idea interesting. So these are the kinds of things that are difficult. So you talk about mentoring and find the right mentor. That is also a difficult thing. You can be in a department where your mentor knows your research area well enough to be efficient. And be in a department, your mentor doesn't really know much about your research area, but is there just to advise you on general questions and so forth. Again, things are going to work out differently. But on the other side, at the receiver and as a mentee, it depends on personalities, how you react to advice. It can work against you as it can work for you. And these things have to be balanced out. I think you were right. Don't listen too much to people that give you the views based on their own experiences. You have to factor in your own experience.
Good. Right.
People that are receptive to new ideas and so forth. So things are, quite complicated, if not complex. So if I talk to somebody, I want to know what they want to accomplish and whether I have something based on my experience that can help them. But in some other cases, I would say, I'm sorry, I'm not prepared for that because, what you want to do is different from I want to do. And the way you are approaching it, I don't know whether I understand it. Maybe you should talk to somebody else and those kinds of things. So it's not really guaranteed that if a department hires you, they are going to give you tenure. I think a department hires you hoping that you will get tenure. And that's a different kind of statement. And once you are in there, the dynamics can change in many different ways, and controlling them requires a lot of skills on you as a newcomer, as opposed to the establishment that is already in the department. It is important to develop networks, but you can also be in a situation like mine, where my networks were actually outside my university and not in my university. And I got better advice from people outside my university than people at my university. So, I mean, how you navigate this is really a complex world. And there is a real problem between African Americans and Africans, because what we get information about each other through white publications. And they trade the stereotypes about each other to the other party. And when we come in contact with each other, we have probably to revisit everything that we have read about the other population. And this is something that very few of us are capable of doing, because we're based on those stereotypes. I can coming to America, I can avoid African Americans because I have been told they are violent. And that is not necessarily the case for every African American. Or the other one is thinking, well, we don't care very much about African Americans, but without really finding out what kind of person I am. So, these things really complicated the world, and in my opinion, is really my reaction to this.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a question, or I'm not sure.
I was
a comment.
Unless somebody else wants to say something. I was going to say one of the things that occurred to me is it's really difficult to compare my experiences to those of other scholars, because when I started college, the country was just coming out of segregation, and much of the initiatives toward integration, racial integration, were seen mostly on the coast and not in the South, not in the Midwest, and so on and so forth. So I was for example, nobody ever called on me in a class to get the Black perspective. I sense that most people at the institutions that I had attended simply wish that I weren't there. A lot of the racism was overt. A small example, if I ask a question or something, the professor would get enraged, particularly if my question contained the possibility that it was an issue that needed to be thought of beyond what the professor had said. And I was, of course, simply innocently, I would say, asking a question. But coming out of the throes of U.S. apartheid, before there were programs designed to get more marginalized students into the university, it was a very different environment, and that has to be taken in. I'm realizing that more and more from this session as I talk. That has to be taken into consideration before I can begin to make the comparisons that I would like to make with other academics' experiences. But the thing that I was trying to state, and maybe I can state it more clearly in terms of the question that I asked Professor Hamer, is I found that an analytical ethnographic approach to institutional environments is what would get me through. For example, various principles. Number one, which I mentioned before, you'll do much better with a white European professor than with a white American professor. And that was very important in undergraduate school and throughout my graduate education. So principles, ethnographic observations, keeping them in mind is basically what got me through my degree programs with whatever success I had getting through them. Maybe that wasn't as necessary later on, where there was more openness to Black students and students of color in general. I don't know, but your remarks and those of Sally's have really started me along a line of thinking that is going to be hard to shake. That's the way I put it. It's a fascinating area. I don't know of a literature on it. There probably is one, but I would just say thank you both for your comments because they certainly spurred my thinking.
So I just wanted to reflect that I really did like the comments as well. I think it's very interesting to see how nuanced the perspective is. I'm not sure whether there are any particular questions. Is there anything you wanted to tease out, Professor Hamer, from the reflections? Or if not, I could, there's some questions that came up in the chat. Is it okay? All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so first and foremost, I just wanted to reflect something that Hala put in the chat. Thank you so much, Professor Hamer, for this inspiring conversation, especially your reflections on mentorship, boundaries, and self-belief. And yes, I think all of us should be our own thinkers. I wanted to lift that up. Now, I wanted to lift up a question from Professor Barnett. He asks, or they ask, I would be interested in understanding how you think about articulating the value of African and or African American studies to undergraduate students. Does naming matter? Does community matter? And how could we be better at attracting ambitious undergrads to our programs?
Oh, well, Scott, you need to be on our committee. I mean, those are really great questions. I will say, so it's not unusual for Africana studies, African American studies, and Makoni can speak more to African studies, that we don't have a lot of majors and minors. It's not unusual, and I'll just talk about African American studies. So African American studies and Black studies more broadly in the U.S. is understood by parents, families who are bringing their students to school to be a place where activism happens, right? And so they generally don't encourage their students to pursue that as a major, or the question is, what are you going to do with that, right? Because there's an assumption that somehow African American studies, African studies is somehow different than other liberal arts majors and minors, when in fact they're all liberal arts majors and minors, right? We walk away with the same skills, the same, there's different sets of knowledge, but the same skills generally, regardless of what you graduate in and liberal arts. So how to convince parents, it's really convincing families, because students generally do have an interest. They enroll in our intro level classes. The question is, why aren't they majoring, right? And from what I can tell, some of that has to do with they're not encouraged to do so by their families. Second, they don't see any outcome on the end that lands them. I'm talking about present day, that lands them a decent wage job. But that's kind of how they think about English, history as well. But African American studies has a different kind of tinge to it, right? And that is that Black power movement that people often associate it with. So when I get students in class and I say, what do you know about African American studies? They're talking about the civil rights and the Black power movement. So I love your question. How do we help them to understand that, there's so much more, right, to African American studies? I don't know if we have time to do that here, but I like to think of Black studies as, again, not simply academic, but it's about moving forward, sort of human people, right? Improving quality of life. And if we can help them to understand that it's not just about the African American experience, but understanding that African American experience or the Black experience helps us to understand humanity, then I think that's been a successful approach, right? So we'll talk more, Scott, I'm sure.
I really like that answer. Just because I wanted to reflect on something that you've said that I really, really, really like. It's that, and especially for me as a scholar who's trying to kind of work in both environments, I often tell my students that you need to understand the global context, because that's your world right now. We are no longer living in little islands and little silos. Right now, what happens in Africa really does affect, whether it's a question of economics or whether it's a question of even academics and how we think and how our intellect works. We really need the input from all these other spaces. So I really love that reflection. Professor Makoni, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I was going to try and see if we can get some of our younger colleagues. Yasmin, Rose, Emma, what are your views about this?
Oh, before we go there, there's a question in the chat box that I wanted to raise up, Professor, before I open it up a little bit. I see that, and I could probably be wrong, but Similo Lua, I hope I've said your name right, says that in my experience, and I don't know if this is true because I didn't go to Austin for undergrad, but it has been surprising to hear the interactions of the African and African American students here at Penn State, because it contradicts my experiences in Austin, also a predominantly white institution, in which rarity of Black people forced the interaction. So I'm not necessarily sure, but I think I kind of understand where that's coming from. And then I wanted to also lift up something else that they reflected. They say, my thought or question is this more a function of isolation and rural America, or what people refer to as exposure? Because I think the peak of African and African American collaborations is pop culture and is happening now. So I think the whole ignorance thingy is not necessarily relevant today. And just to go back to Professor Makoni, to open that up for the younger generation to elaborate a little bit more. But Professor Hamer, if there's anything you wanted to reflect.
Who would like to come in?
A lot there. I'm not sure are you asking me to, I mean, I don't even know where to start.
Oh yeah, I guess maybe, sorry, because I think you're at Penn State now.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was like, oh, you've been at Austin, using at Penn State. I was just like trying to like contra from your experience, do those things compare or do they contradict each other? And if they come, if they're like the experiences are like similar or if they're opposite, like why do you think they're similar or why do you think they're opposite?
I don't think that the experience of undergrad students here at Penn State that is African and African American, I don't think that that's unique to Penn State. In fact, I know it's not unique to Penn State. So that doesn't mean it's perfectly it's always the same. It's just not unique. So why do I think that? So when if we think about how students learn, right? They don't just learn in the classroom, they're learning from social media, right? They're learning from, hearsay and all that sort of thing. And so African American students, just like people in the United States more broadly, have assumptions about people who come from the continent, right? There's a lot of negative stereotypes. Well, those don't go away, right? Just because people from the continent are coming to the United States, right? So when we engage with others, we oftentimes fall on those stereotypes or allow those stereotypes to kind of lead us into a conversation, right? How we engage with someone, how we think about them, right? We have to really get to know them before those stereotypes begin to break away. Okay. And I think that's one of the benefits of bringing these two units together, right? And kind of forces students to come together around conversations that they might never have. And it's the same for folks coming from China, coming from Nigeria, coming from Brazil. They come to the United States. They have some assumptions about African Americans, right? That's just the reality because we learn in all kinds of ways: television, movies, right? Commercial ads. Right. And so when people meet for the first time, they're working with those stereotypes, those negative stereotypes, and some positive ones. Right. But if we don't work to break those down to help students to see a reality, then they'll just continue to move forward with those stereotypes. And then, of course, you add on the political moment, right? Here, where we have a president who's saying that immigrants are taking away American jobs. There's just a lot in the political climate right now that simply adds on to that. But the differences that students see between themselves, African or Black and African American, those aren't unique to Penn State.
Thank you for that reflection. I wanted to, I do agree with that. I'm so sorry. I see you, Desmond. So give me 1 second. I saw a question that thank you so much, Scott, for raising it. I might have glossed over. I didn't see it. It had moved down in the chat. But Emma asks a very, very good question tied to this question on narratives and singularities. But she asks, you spoke about feeling isolated earlier on, and I'm so grateful that was mentioned. What struck a chord with me is that in my program, I'm the only one in many aspects. And I'm wondering if you have any advice on how to come out of that, how to connect with others so you can grow, and who can also help you to grow too. And that's actually a really great question because I know you helped me with my stereotypes. When I worked in here, I had, this and that. And you were like, well, girl. So I'm grateful for that. So I echo Emma's question. How do we come out of feeling like the only one? How can we grow and how can we find mentors who help us do this?
I think that's a good
question, please.
Yeah, Emma. Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much.
No, thank you too. When I said only one, I wasn't necessarily talking about race and gender because I think that's where the conversation was steering towards. But I also mean in your academic way of thinking as well. And so I think from my experience, it's been hard to collaborate with other scholars, or I find myself as the only person doing the type of research I am in my lab. I'm the only one in my lab. And so I think that's where that only one is coming from when I asked my question.
Yeah. And I'm happy to talk with you outside of here, just FYI, and when Jury can connect us. Yeah, that's actually really a challenge, right? There are so many ways that we are unique, that we bring our unique selves into a space, right? And it's not just race and gender, it's language, right? English as a second language. There's all these kinds of things going on. And then, of course, there's your research question. And we oftentimes come to our research questions based on our own background, our own curiosities, right? That are unique. Um, so I will just say at the outside, Emma, I think you hold on to what you know is you, right? But also, if there's someone there, like a faculty member, that you can talk with about your research, that may be helpful because you may not get a lot of support from peers in the lab. Um, but from a faculty member, you may, and you just need one, right, to start out with, because you're a new graduate student, right? So how long have you been a grad student?
I will be defending this summer.
Okay. So you have an advisor.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And your advisor, I'm going to assume, is an ally. Okay. Maybe we should talk offline. Let's talk offline.
All right,
Okay.
I'll connect the two of
Please
you.
do. Yeah. Let's do
I
that.
will do.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Emma. Desmond, hi. Welcome.
Thanks, Wanjiru. Thanks, everyone, and thanks to Professor Hamer for this stimulating conversation. Gentle, kind, but stimulating in many ways. I was going to ask a very quick question, but while you were responding, a couple of thoughts popped up that I wanted to share before I go to those two questions, one of which I'm hoping will sort of shift gears in some ways. The very first comment coming from Emma's question, again, this question of feeling like the only one. I wonder if this is partly because I wonder if this is something partly peculiar to the academia. And I don't suggest that uh, the academia is probably the only place this happens, it's the place I'm most familiar with. And this is largely because I think the academia operates with a set of perverse incentives for competition, for visibility, for certain kinds of rewards that create certain anxieties whenever people come together. And there are already some narrative tensions around even knowledge production and validation that I think set the tone for this to happen. So I wonder if part of what we are wrestling with here is questions about how to make sense of our presence and operation within a system that's already structured in a particular way to produce particular outcomes. How do you make sense of the anxieties and tensions and contradictions that are inherent in the system? The other thing, there are notes going back to the dynamics between within the Black community, broadly speaking, and particularly the recent immigrants to the Americas and those who've been here much longer and came on often different terms. I think what is striking to me about this is how perennial this question is. Um, I was born and grew up in this colonial business center they call Nigeria, and moved to the US more than 20 years ago. And this was the very first reality that confronted me, something I never expected. As a matter of fact, my very first research and very first academic presentation was on this subject. And there's an anecdote that sort of crystallizes that experience for me. A few years after I had been in the US, a very close friend of mine came to visit. He was at St. John's University and then came to Chicago to visit me. I went to pick him up at the bus station. He arrived on Greyhound, young students trying to move around as cheaply as he could. And we were driving to my house, and he asked me, how do you understand these people? He used the term these people. I'm like, which people? And he says, African Americans. And immediately that piqued my interest. I was like, what are you talking about? And then he goes off on the typical stereotypes that I think most of us are familiar with, that I'm sure he must have been picking up from television and whichever other sources that he was paying attention to. And he was struggling with this because he didn't want to believe them, but it seemed like this is all he was getting. And I asked him, have you tried to make friends, sort of to get close to any one of them you have on your campus? Which I think from my understanding, is a predominantly white institution. And he says, yeah, I've tried to have lunch with them. I'm not sure it went very well. Like, we really didn't connect. So he was always observing them from a distance. And the tone of his voice in this conversation suggested to me that he was already buying into those stereotypes. And I was still driving, and I said to him, you know what? I'll tell you what I think. I think all of you Nigerians are 419ers and scammers, including you. All you guys are doing is just out there to dupe people and take people's stuff and so on and so forth. Now, the friend I was talking to is a priest. And he turns like, no, that's not true. I'm like, no, it's true. Even you, you're a 419er, you're a scammer. I kept going at him that way. It took me a moment before he sort of came to his senses to recognize what was happening. And the only other thing I said was just go to the US Department of State's website and look at what the travel advisory says about Nigeria. Tell me if you can relate to that Nigeria. To me, that was the end of that conversation. Now, I highlight this because this is almost 20 years ago. And we're still having these conversations. And I'm wondering, what else can we do to ensure that the next generation of African Americans or Africans moving to the US aren't repeating these same conversations that we've been having over and over again? What can we do as scholars, especially if we're working in contexts where, like you said, you don't have a lot of African American studies major or even African studies major? Like, you don't have non-Africans, certainly, but even most African students and African Americans don't major in this. We are looking for the more lucrative majors. What can we do? You have people like I Show Speed, traveling across the continent trying to change those narratives. I suspect is part of the agenda. There are so many other people doing other things in other contexts. What else can we do as scholars to begin to change or buck that trend? My last question that I'm thinking might move the sort of shift focus to something slightly different. In your initial conversation with Professor Makoni, these sort of personal reflections, you got me, wondering about our respective journeys into the academia, right? As against a series of other things. And there's something I've always found perplexing. I've raised this question in different forms in this forum. Formal schooling in the US, certainly, and I think in virtually every context I know in Africa, was designed as a tool of oppression and deracination. It was intended to yank you off your community, for your background and so forth, and make you amenable to the extractive game of imperialism. It seems interesting to me that it is also to the schools that we often run to rectify those damages. That is a system that was designed precisely for our exclusion and destruction. Is often what we run to try to deal with those issues. Is there a fundamental flaw in that way of thinking? Because I'm emphasizing schooling here, not education, right? Should we, as a people who have been under this sort of intense systemic pressure, should we take more seriously the obligation to begin to construct alternative ways of educating ourselves and our younger generation that does not depend on these formal systems of schooling, so that we can begin to free ourselves of the knotty tangles and complications and contradictions I think I might have been referring to in my very first remark? Why do we always choose to run to the same places that terrorize us in many ways? Or is it unavoidable? Like, is this just something you can't do without, even if it's unpleasant and unsavory? Anyway, thank you again for these brilliant remarks.
Before you respond, Professor Hamer, I just wanted to take an opportunity to recognize the time. It's 10:30, so I'd like to stop recording and move us to the after party and just thank absolutely every single person who has participated, who attended, and who is here. Once again, Professor Hamer, that was wonderful. Please stay with us. I'm just stopping the recording for here. And once again, Professor Makoni, thank you so much for the conversation that you had. And yes, I'm just stopping the recording now.
Okay, good. Okay,